Thank you, Helen. Take it away.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on how novel data and insights can help address the problem of tropical deforestation. This really fits into the transparency strategy, the systems change that Sally introduced this morning. If you suddenly can't hear me, yell, so I'm not talking to myself. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the problem and what Trace is as a data innovation to address the problem. And then I'm going to share a few data insights from Trace and how this is being used by decision makers. And finally, I'm going to come to a few lessons and principles for how we can harness the power of data for systems change as well. So very briefly on the problem. So at the climate conference in Glasgow last year, which was hosted by the UK government, they put front and center the role of nature in tackling the climate crisis. And in particular, the role of tropical deforestation in terms of its role as a carbon sink, a carbon store, and a carbon source through deforestation. And yet, what we saw last year in 2021 was that just under 4 million hectares of primary tropical forests were cleared. Nearly all of this was for agriculture, both directly for the expansion of pasture land for cattle, for palm oil, for soy, but also indirectly through land speculation, clearance of land using fire. And of these commodities, so soft commodities, beef, soy, palm oil, the majority are consumed domestically, but more than a third are exported globally to markets like the EU, China, and of course the UK as well. And this is a problem I'm going to talk to you about today, and which Trace addresses. So Trace, it's a partnership between a number of civil society organizations led by Global Canopy and Stockholm Environment Institute. And it's a data-driven supply chain transparency initiative. So what Trace does is it brings together disparate sources of publicly available data to map these commodity supply chains at scale. And what it does is it connects countries of import, like the EU, like the UK, companies, to subnational regions of sourcing, and critically to impacts like deforestation in those regions. At the moment, Trace covers more than 60% of the global trade in these soft commodities. So beef, soy from South America, palm oil from Indonesia, cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire. So the problem that Trace addresses, so this is to date, the data that's available on global trade. So this is from Comtrade, but it could also be from FAO. So it shows you, in this case, the volume and value of soy being exported from Brazil to the rest of the world. And it shows you at a national scale and without any information on companies. What Trace does, if this video is going to work, is it maps the soy being produced in, oh, I can get this video to load. Might need a bit of technical support. So this should be a video. Sorry, so I'll explain. So on the left-hand side of the map, you can see these are all the soy producing municipalities in Brazil. There's more than 2,000 of them. And Trace maps the flow of commodities. I can do it without the video. And I can show you afterwards if anyone's interested. So we map the flow of commodities from these municipalities by the soy crushing facilities, through the exporting companies, the importing companies, to the countries of destination. You can see on the right-hand side, such as China. And this enables us for all 100 million tons that Brazil exported of soy in 2018. And this enables us to filter the data and to ask questions of it. So for example, you can see somewhere like the United Kingdom or Germany, you can identify which of the companies that are exporting soy directly to these countries and where is it coming from? You know, where should these companies really focus their efforts in terms of addressing these risks? So just briefly, just to flag, this is a replicable approach. I'm just going to briefly touch on the data that we use to do this. So we use per shipment trade data. This is the backbone of Trace, and you can see an example here, which provides the companies that export the data, export the commodities from ports of export to ports of import, the volume and value of these commodities. We then map back the most likely sources of these commodities back to these subnational sourcing regions using physical asset data, so data on slaughterhouses, crushing facilities, mills, disclosures on supply chain connections, so who's buying from who, data on tax ownership to connect the dots, and of course data on commodity production, so where are these commodities grown. And we then overlay these with information on impacts, so particularly deforestation, but you could also use data on slave labor, carbon emissions, water. So I'm just going to now share a few insights from this data to give you a flavor of what it tells us. So the first set of insights are really around this trade and what it looks like. So from the data we have, we can see that more than half of the trade in these soft commodities is handled by 5 companies. That's crazy. 5 companies globally handle more than half the trade in soy, beef, palm oil. And what this market concentration means in the trading segment and supply chain, given that these traders have relationships with producers and they have close proximity, is that they're uniquely placed to support the transition to zero deforestation. We see the same, this video I don't think it's going to work either, but we see the same with China. So we see that in terms of the consumer markets, that China buys more than half of soft commodities globally in terms of imports. So any action by the EU, some of you may be aware that the EU has a new legislation on due diligence for deforestation that's currently going through Parliament. That's got to be seen in the light of what China does. So it's a really important market signal from the EU, but equally the EU really needs to engage China as well if we're going to solve this problem. It also provides a bit of nuance as well to the data. So in terms of, and it demonstrates why that these countries have different sourcing patterns, and those different sourcing patterns therefore have differences in terms of their impact. So the blue line here is the EU, the yellow line is China. And this is the relative risk, this is the deforestation risk associated with the imports of soy over the past decade per ton. And you can see that the EU is much higher than China over the past decade, although they're now coming together. And the reason for that is that the EU, it's simple economics. The EU buys from more northern ports in Brazil because those northern ports are closer to the EU. And the north of Brazil is where the active soy deforestation frontier has been. So companies and consumers in the EU have generally had higher exposure than Chinese consumers over the past decade. And this comes on to the second set of insights. And this is around the nature of the risk that consumer markets and companies are exposed to from sourcing these commodities. This risk is highly concentrated, and this makes the problem tangible. From the millions of shipments that we see, you can really suddenly narrow down to specific areas where investments are needed in terms of traceability, in terms of incentives on the ground. So this map here shows the exports of soy from Brazil to China in 2018. And you can see on the right-hand side, a place called Matopiba. So this is a soy deforestation frontier in northeast Brazil. And you can see that this region only provided about less than 10% of the volume of soy to China in that year, yet it was responsible for nearly 80% of the deforestation risk that China had associated with its soy impacts. So this problem is really concentrated, and we see this across commodities and across contexts. Normally we see around more than half the deforestation risk associated with these commodities is in less than 5% of sourcing regions. So it is a tangible problem. It also means that sourcing matters. So companies sourcing from places with the highest risk are normally exposed to more than 10 times of the average carbon emissions. If you're thinking about scope 3 emission exposure, where you buy from has a huge impact in terms of what that looks like. And it also shows some of this application for new generations of life cycle analysis. So at the moment, life cycle analysis is based on national factors. This is an example if you were to use a subnational factors and data from Trace. So the red in this graph is emissions from land use change from deforestation. And you can see these different countries and their exposure of emissions are linked to soy imports per ton coming from South America. And you can see at the top is Spain, with one of the highest emissions per ton, And that's because a huge amount of those emissions are driven by land use change. And that's because a lot of soy coming into Spain comes from those northern ports, comes from the deforestation frontier. And you can see actually China has a much lower deforestation emissions per ton. And that's again because of where it's sourcing from. It also links into things like transport. Soy coming from the north is trucked long distances. These trucks have big carbon emissions associated with them, as well as the actual shipping routes themselves. And finally, the third set of insights is around setting baselines and monitoring progress. So there's a lot of corporate zero deforestation commitments. What our data can show is where there's gaps. So we can see that there's gaps in terms of commodities like Brazilian beef, where less than a third of Brazilian beef exports are covered by commitments. But importantly, these commitments are also focused around the Amazon. But actually, we know a lot of deforestation for pasture occurs in the Chaco in Paraguay. It occurs in the Cerrado, which is a wooded biome in the south of Brazil as well. And that's not being covered by these voluntary commitments. In terms of monitoring progress of these commitments, you'd expect, if these private governance commitments are effective, that companies with such ZDC commitments would have a lower exposure to deforestation risk in their imports than companies without such commitments. To date for Trace, we haven't seen any evidence that that's the case, with the exception of last month, we launched some new data on Indonesian palm oil exports. And what you see here is a deforestation risk per ton of palm oil exports from Indonesia. Companies, the dots in red are companies without any ZDC commitment. The companies in green on the right is the intensity of deforestation risk per ton of companies with commitments. And you can see actually for the first time that there is some evidence that companies, the average deforestation risk per ton of exports to palm oil companies with commitments is lower than those without commitments. And that's really encouraging. So who uses Trace? I've shown you some hopefully interesting insights, but how is this data being used? So it's being used both on the enabling side to support public sector, private sector investors, banks, companies who've made commitments to remove deforestation from their supply chains and financing. And it's also being used by accountability groups to hold them accountable for their impacts as well. So media, civil society. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of these as well. So the EU, as I briefly mentioned, is in the process, we hope, of adopting quite hugely advanced legislation around due diligence for deforestation for imports of soft commodities into the EU. Trace data has been used to inform and advocate for the scope of this legislation, both in terms of which commodities are included, but also the definition of forests, which might sound quite geeky, but it's super important. So in the initial proposal, the forest definition used excluded the Cerrado biome that I mentioned earlier. However, when you look at EU patterns of sourcing, most of the EU sourcing is from this biome, and that's where the EU has its huge deforestation risk exposure. That's now been, that's now the extension based on Trace data. They've extended the definition to now include the Cerrado, which hopefully will mean it has much more impact. It's also been used by the French government. So the French government has a zero deforestation import strategy. Trace data is the only data available on a per shipment basis that they can use. So they're using this data to support companies to assess risks based on shipments, suppliers, ports coming into France to be able to do their due diligence. And it's also been used by Germany, German government in terms of assessing their total deforestation exposure. Briefly touching on companies, so downstream companies, so retailers, people like Sainsbury's, Tesco's, manufacturers, there's quite a lot of distance between them and on the ground. So they've been using Trace data to collectively understand which of the municipalities where they have highest risk exposure collectively, where they can make investments. So whether that's financial support for farmers who are protecting forests, supporting compliance with legality, where can they make those investments out of their supply chain to bridge that gap between downstream companies and the ground. Storebrand, it's a Norwegian investor, have been using Trace data as well to prioritize which companies they engage in their portfolio. And they've actually used the data to evidence a shareholder resolution filed at Bunge last year to strengthen their zero deforestation commitment as well. And finally, it's been used in due diligence in terms of investigating illegality, potential illegality by a beef company in Marfrig. So just finally to wrap up, so I want to just end on some principles for harnessing the power of data that we've learned through Trace. So first of all, data collection is costly. It's really expensive. And the first questions you need to ask is what data is sufficient to answer a question and what is feasible. And you need to balance that feasibility and the effectiveness. Secondly, most of the most useful data that we use in Trace was collected for a different purpose. So to map cattle supply chains, we use animal transport records. These are designed for sanitary purposes, but we use them to see which cows are being moved between farms before they reach a slaughterhouse. So a lot of the data will be there and can be used in other innovative ways. Don't think this video is going to work, sadly, but it will help me with timekeeping. Finally, data are more useful when they're connected to other data. So in Indonesia, companies reported on which meals they were buying from. They all used different names, different IDs, and it was a bit of a mess. The Universal Meals List, developed by WRI to start with, basically said, can we use a common ID for each meal? So each company started reporting against this common list of IDs, and this has enabled us in mapping Indonesian palm oil exports to see across the entire sector which companies are buying from which mill at a sector level, not case by case. So it's transformative where you can connect different data sets together. And finally, data, transparency, traceability is only a means to an end. So ultimately what matters is change on the ground, and transparency cannot replace governance and incentives, which are really needed for the transition to sustainable supply chains. And with that, I will end, open for any questions as well. And I'm around for the rest of the day in case anyone would like to see some very fancy video demos.
Thanks, Helen. My name's Ed Evans from the Open Data Institute. Fascinated by your talk, and what is going through my mind is that as you mentioned, the data is being repurposed. It wasn't collected originally for that purpose, which is really good to see. But what are the sources of the data? Are they public domain data, or is it an engagement that organisations have to participate in a kind of collective? Or can you talk a little bit about the source of the data?
Yes, I can. So it's publicly available or publicly purchasable. Publicly purchasable is a slightly grey area. So the backbone of Trace is per shipment trade data. It's collected by intelligence companies and resold, like US data is available through peers. It's previously just been used for making a lot of money on trade intelligence. We're the first group we know of that's decided that it can be used for sustainability. So that was the innovation behind Trace. Data on assets, silos, and others, it is available generally either from industry associations or through the magic of Google. A lot of the work that we do is on cleaning, processing data and enabling it to connect together, whether that's through company ownership and understanding the legal hierarchy of companies. So to understand, okay, Bungi Alimentos, who's exporting this particular shipment, is the same company as Bungi Paraguay, who owns this silo over here. So a lot of it is around making those connections. All of our data is available to download. It's out there both via split graph, where you can access it in bulk tables, but also via the tool as well. But I think, yeah, it's really around cleaning, processing that data, and really understanding the landscape of data. So I think that's where we've had our biggest impact to date. And we've done a bit of work with other groups. So Minderoo Foundation, some of you may know them, put out a report recently on plastics. We're not going to start going into the world of plastics, but it demonstrated that you could use the same principles, the same data sets to start looking at other commodities and other impacts as well. There's a question over there.
This is amazing. Well done. Are you seeing a movement at all from supermarkets, brands? I mean, when we talk about brands, there's like 10. Oh, so there's lots of brands, but there's about 10 companies that own all those brands. Are we seeing any attempts to move this into the kind of consumer space so that we can actually make more informed decisions?
So we are. So a lot of the supermarkets and brands have made these zero deforestation commitments. One of the challenges they have is things like, so all of you will have heard of palm oil because of orangutans. I'm assuming that a lot of you think about palm oil when you're buying things, about whether it's palm oil free or whether it's certified. Things like soy, it's animal feed. It's not very sexy. No one really knows what it is, and it's very hidden. And that's a bit of a problem. The other thing is that there's this myth, so we call it hard truths. One of the hard truths is that people are not willing to pay a premium for sustainable commodities. We know that's not the case, and we can't push that down. So there is always this tension between the downstream end of the supply chain pushing costs on suppliers and suppliers pushing costs back. And that tension is there to stay. And I think the question that we're trying to raise is understanding the transparency of the supply chain and who's making the profits where. We need to share those costs equitably along the supply chain, so it's not just borne by consumers one end or by producers the other end. I think that's why there's also been a big call for legislation, because, you know, as a consumer, I shouldn't have to go to a shop and be like, oh, so I want to buy a product which has no human rights in or has, you know, some slave labor. Like, that shouldn't be my problem. So I think there's also that, you know, that's a realization as well, that, you know, legislation is needed because it shouldn't be on consumers to make those decisions. Last question at the back.
Hi, you just mentioned human rights, and then this is about sustainability.
Yes.
So my question is, when I've been doing research into all these green solutions for the last 10 years, and the nature of supply chains is that you have to go right to the core, right to the beginning of the supply chain, basically touching the void that no one else wants to touch. And that's not a factory in Dusseldorf or Yorkshire. That's going back all the way to factories and the forests in India and Africa. When I've done my research, and there's a lot of talk about leave no indigenous ethnic majority behind, how many people have actually taken the time to look at the full supply chains, including the human rights abuses, for the renewables, for the electric cars, the solar panels, the wind turbines, littered with them. And when I see my forests, hundreds of acres deforested to make a product which is going to capture carbon, but those people are being kicked off the land, I've got a question, which is, where's the human rights in that? And when the chickens come home to roost in the UK, are people in the UK going to clear off their land to make way to get those resources? Where's the sustainability holistically in these supply chains?
So fully agree with your point. I think what we've seen over the last few years is that human rights, I think it's a classic, you know, where the nature issue has taken precedence, and it has been almost a neo-colonial dialogue around nature. But we are seeing, so on Trace, we also map land conflict, we map slave labor, and we map where there's indigenous people's territories. We see it's a critical part of the solution, and one that isn't talked about, but it is starting to be more at the table. So, for example, the EU legislation that's coming will require traceability back to the farm level, but through the advocacy of NGOs, it will now include mentions of international human rights. And why that's so important is because a lot of these countries' human rights do not meet international standards. So I agree with you, it's a critical part of the issue. You know, we see from just looking at Brazil's forests, the areas which are standing are those that have been protected by indigenous peoples for centuries. And a lot of that, you know, a lot of deforestation goes hand in hand with human rights abuses, people being kicked off land clearances, and that needs to be talked about and needs to be important.
But the question, the concern is, firstly, the renewables are fossil fuel free. No, they're not. They're fully reliant on burning coal to make the whole process of a wind turbine. Secondly, all the lithium and the cobalt extracted from stolen indigenous land, people talk about conflict minerals. I was like, I don't remember these people actually giving up their land in the first place. So it's not about conflict minerals. It's about the rights and the sovereignty of those people who actually hold the resources. Most of the time they're indigenous and they're women. And if no one's looking at the full supply chain, and then also 10 years time, we're going to dump all that crap back in Africa, then there's something seriously wrong with the supply chains and the green solutions.
So
I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up this talk now, but thank you.
Just to agree with you that, and the EU legislation does go back full traceability with a recognition that you have to go back to the farm level, particularly to understand the question around human rights abuses as well.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that.